Hello, everybody. It's great to be with you again today. Today, I have the great honour of speaking with two wonderful advocates and people who've been peer workers for a long time in their positions and have also in leadership roles now, lived experience leadership roles. So we're going to talk to you today about the history of peer work and the importance of it as well. Before we start speaking, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the different lands that we're working on and living on, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and we recognise that this land was never ceded. I'd also like to acknowledge everyone with lived experience. This world needs to be a lot kinder place for sensitive people and people who've been traumatised and have mental health issues. So we also acknowledge people who care about people with lived experience. And we know that's everyone watching this video. So thank you very much. So I'd like to introduce you to Paula Hanlon. Paula is an amazing person, amazing advocate who actually sits on the Flourish Australia board, but also is the longest serving peer worker in the public system. And then we're also talking with Tim Heffernan, who is the Deputy Commissioner with the New South Wales Mental Health Commission, and who I had the great honour of meeting when he is doing some work with the Black Dog Institute, and also when he was a peer worker in the public system in the Illawarra. But I'll let them tell you more about their work. Paula, can I?
Yeah, hi, I'm Paula Hanlon, and I'm working currently in a community mental health setting, and I've been there for 26 and a half years in a paid role. I was in the role voluntary for 3 years before that. So that would have been January of 95 when I first joined the Ride Consumer Network. I would have joined a year earlier, when Michael Appleton started the Ride Consumer Network, but he kept asking me to join this consumer group, and I thought he was talking about the shopping centre. So I didn't, I kept saying no, until later in that year I discovered the term consumer was the new language for clients. So, language is really important.
It's
Because if
changed a
people
lot over the years, hasn't
Oh,
it?
it has. Oh,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah. And we've seen that with the work that the MHCC, the Mental Health Coordinating Council, has done with their language guide. Yeah. And which is fantastic. But yeah, language is really important for people to understand who we are and what we do. Well, back in 95 was the development of the Advocates program at Rozelle Hospital, which was the first of its kind. So there were Leonie Mans and Helen Bloom developed the guidelines for this program, and Helen was the coordinator of the program, and so there were a team of advocates that worked on the Rozelle Hospital site and visited the units and were provided peer advocacy. And yeah, it was a fantastic program, and it sort of led the way then. And Peter Sharkin then became a peer worker in the community setting, which was, I guess, a precursor for Northern Sydney to develop our peer workforce. And even though it still took a few years for all of the sectors to establish a peer workforce, but my position was advertised in 97 and I started in January of 1998, and I've had the pleasure of being there ever since. And I think one of the things that has aided my longevity was that I had supervision, external peer supervision in place from week one. And I was very fortunate to have Leonie Mans as my external peer supervisor, who was, very knowledgeable in the mental health field. She was a teacher by background. She had a lot of skills, and she was the first person I ever saw stand up and talk. And she started by saying, I'm a person with mental illness. And she was talking in this forum with lots of people. And I thought, I want to do that. So she was so much of an inspiration for me.
I was just looking back at this book here,
Mm-hmm.
which I think, Faye, you perhaps edited that, didn't you?
Yeah, I was one of the editors.
There was a meeting in '92, and this all coincided with the first National Mental Health Plan and strategy, which really pushed consumer participation for the first time. And that the hospital-based peer work started in 1993, and Peter moved into his position in 1995. I've got a quote from Helen, which I put in this little chapter, actually. So she said, the group, this is the group that met in late 1992 at Rozelle. The group thought that consumers, because of their experience coping with mental illness, had certain expertise in the mental health field. They were ideal to advocate for patients because they have a consumer's experience with the mental health system and could understand and empathise with problems patients were facing. So that was great, wasn't it? You know, just that. And she sort of undersold it a little bit, had certain expertise in the mental health field. I think we claim a bit more than that.
Yeah, I think though, given the time that she said that, the era that she said that, was really brave to say it as strongly as she did, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when did you start, Tim? How did you start? When did you start?
Well, I was much later than Paula, but a different trajectory in terms of the mental health system as well. So I first hit the mental health system when I was 23 in 1983, and I had quite a reasonable hospitalisation. And then 2 years later, I had a very bad hospitalisation at Kenmore. Both times I had a sort of delusional psychosis. The first time, I had diagnosis of schizophrenia, and then changed to bipolar or manic depression and all that. The second one, I remember it was quite difficult. There was a lot of seclusion, restraint, and really, like I'd say, violence in the system at that stage. And I do remember, the people I was on the ward with, the relationship we had, that peer relationship, was really important in supporting me through that hospitalisation. People helped out when you were in distress. People made sure that you were looked after if, when you came out of seclusion, things like that, when you're upset. And so that's always stayed in my mind. But I went back, sort of ran away from the hospital, from the system for a while then, and taught went back to teaching and taught for 20 years. So I didn't get into lived experience roles till 2007, which was initially in a lived experience role with Black Dog Institute, talking about my personal experience of recovery, mental health and recovery, to rural and regional Australia, New South Wales people. And it was about raising awareness during the drought, when there was a lot of rural suicide and issues there. And then a couple of years later, 2009, I went for a job at the rehab ward at Shell Harbour near Wollongong, and didn't get it. But then the team, one of the teams here, the community mental health rehab team, I spoke to them in my role with Black Dog, and then they offered me a 1 day a week position, which was, and the language thing, that was in a role called a consumer rehabilitation assistant. So the concept of peer is relatively new, I think, because we went from that in the Illawarra, from that to a consumer worker. It was well into 2015, 16, 17, we came into that term peer worker. And there was some resistance to that change in language at the time, that the word consumer was really important to keep there. But it seems that we're moved out of that there, and it's probably a term that, Paula nailed it. I think a lot of people get the wrong idea about what it means. A lot of people get the feeling that it's about dependency. But the same with peer, people have problems with that word because they see that all roles, they think that all roles for lived experience are peer support roles, where there's a whole range of roles, including a general manager role, which I've got. So we've moved towards, in the National Peer Workforce Development Guidelines, which I was lucky to be a co-chair on that with Margaret Doherty, who was the carer co-chair, and working with Louise Burns' team from RMIT. A lot of the research around that they did was that consumer was falling out of favour, and so the guidelines adopted lived experience peer worker for the whole of the workforce. But I think it's still evolving. I don't know.
Yeah, I guess.
So I worked in that community rehab position for a while, and I did some advocacy work on the wards, similar to what Paula's role would be. And I moved into in 2017, I think, across to the Primary Health Network, and worked there.
In a designated lived experience role?
That was a designated lived experience role. It was called a peer workforce coordinator. So it was about really strengthening the peer workforce in those Commonwealth funded services through PHN. But also what we did there was develop a lot of physical networks of peer workers who met up across all of the organisations and formed really strong connections, peer connections, relationships, where the peer part of us was probably more important than who we worked for, in terms of the way we saw ourselves or see ourselves. So that's still going, and it's really important. Yeah,
that's probably the case for many people, isn't it? We see our community, our lived experience community, the people that we work for, as more important, really, as bigger than the service that we're working for.
Yeah, and in terms of history, it probably comes back to the social justice movement that we began with.
We also have carer lived experience peer workers.
Yeah.
So I
That's
think
made it really problematic, hasn't it? That carer and consumer, I don't like the word consumer myself, but that they've been lumped together. And I think that's really complicated things.
Yes.
I think it's compromised the people with lived experience, and it's compromised the carer experience as well, and the positions around that.
Yeah, I think you have to
go on, Tim, sorry.
Oh no, I was just saying back to the guidelines. So we recognise that issue, and so people, the consumer, it's a personal lived experience of mental health issues, and then it's people with a lived experience of caring, family, and kinship groups. That sort of thing. So it does require another phrase, because if you say lived experience today, really you're really including both, and you have to make sure you differentiate them when you need to.
In Flourish we say lived experience for consumer, and carer experience, care or family experience for care or family experience. It's so simple, doesn't confuse anybody. Were you in paid positions, Paula and Tim? Initially?
Not in those early days. The consumer network was a fantastic way for us to develop our skills, confidence, knowledge, experience within the sector, within, understanding the mental health system. And I do acknowledge that we have new guidelines now for the payment of non-employed consumers or lived experience people, but it hasn't been implemented. I know in my area, I don't know about others, but I think that's a big loss.
And Tim, were you paid initially when you started working?
Well, the work I did with the Black Dog Institute was purely voluntary. So there was you'd recoup expenses, if you had to travel or stuff like that. so, but always paid as a peer worker with the public mental health.
Wow.
And yeah, no, there's a great. I agree with Paula. It's important to be paying people who are not in peer work positions if they're participating in the work of the local health district. And I think it varies from LHD to LHD how that's implemented.
Mm. I certainly worked as a volunteer for a long time. That my career in mental health started after a conversation with a peer worker who was one of the very early peer workers, and her title was not peer worker. I can't remember what it was. It was consumer something.
Advocate.
Yeah, something like that. And I was very distressed after I'd been given the diagnosis that I'd been given, and had been told that I'd never work and never be a valuable member of society. And she spoke with me saying that she had that same diagnosis, but she worked and she paid a mortgage and contributed to her family and community. And then she challenged me in a really loving way that I think only peers can do, really. And she lovingly said to me, in fact, Faye, if I can do it, you can. And in fact, what gives you the right not to do it if you can do it? And she said, you need to stop seeing yourself as a victim and start looking at what you can do to improve your life and maybe to improve the lives of others. And so I started volunteer work with, I was the first lived experience speaker for Beyond Blue and the Rotary Health Research Fund. And that was all volunteer. You know, they paid expenses, of course, but it was all volunteer. But I remember, I remember going, the way we were treated back in the early days was really harsh. Well, in my experience, it was really harsh. There was 8 of us, I think, that were allowed to go to the FEMS conference, and that Sane Australia, Barbara Hocking, advocated for us to go. And we had the name tags. Everybody had a name tag, but we noticed our name tags had a dot on them, which differentiated us from the other people. So we were the mad ones with the dots. Be careful of the people with the dots. And the people with the dots weren't allowed to eat with the other delegates at the conference. Most of whom at that stage were researchers and psychiatrists. So when we realized that they had what the dots meant, we spoke to Barbara, who was the CEO of Sane Australia then, and she was ropeable and she went into bat for us. And there was a lot of angst around it all. And I think on the 3rd day, we were allowed to eat with the others. But I remember being on a committee and sitting, so this is for New South Wales peer workers in the public sector now I'm talking about, sitting on a committee at the ministry and advocating, we were fighting really, but for the right to be paid for our work. And we fought for it for, I think, like 18 months or 2 years or something on that committee. Finally, they agreed that we could be paid. And it was a really huge issue at the time. I wasn't able to be paid because I wasn't in an employed position at the time. I was an independent advocate. And so I fought hard, really hard, because I didn't have a conflict of interest. So I was fighting for the people to get paid, but I wouldn't get paid. Around 98 or thereabouts, I started working as a peer worker in the public system. But I think the title had consumer in it then as well, consumer consultant. I think it was that title, but it was an advocacy, a systemic advocacy and individual advocacy role. So I advocated with and for people who wanted me to, who couldn't speak for themselves, in tribunal hearings, in putting complaints forward, but I also advocated for systemic change in meetings. And I became a manager then of peer workers. And back then, I think we had 8 peer workers, which back then that was pretty much unheard of, to have that many. And it's still unheard of, shamefully, in some services now to have that many. But my experience in the early days was, you know, if I put a complaint in about on behalf of somebody or with somebody about the way they'd been treated or whatever, I would often have threats, and death threats were very regular for me. Phone call death threats and notes slipped under my door and things like that. And it was very common to be abused. I actually had a doctor tweaking the end of my nose over and over again one day, and yelling at me and spit flying in my face. And these are my colleagues. If you think about it today, you know, how the way they treated us back then, you know, workplace relationships and work health and safety and what do they call it? Moral injury, you know, like if you think about what we had to put up with, you know, my ties would be slashed, my ties would be let down, you know, all of that kind of thing. And they would often say that whenever I supported somebody to put in a complaint, that I was just one of them. So there was an us and them thing.
Yes.
I was one of them, and that I should be put into seclusion and restraint, and I should be injected. And, you know, I was one of their colleagues.
Yeah.
And they treated me like that. So how were they treating the people? You know, therefore, of course, the way that kind of attitude leads to the complaints that people who are supposed to be in a healing environment.
Yeah. Look, I can remember some examples too where I'd be in a meeting, and if I expressed anger or frustration, I would be asked after the meeting, "Are you okay, Paula? Are you having, you heading towards a relapse? Do you need to take some time off work?" And I'd just say, "No, I was angry. I'm allowed to express my emotions." You know, and this is stuff you shouldn't have to be explaining to clinicians.
That's right.
But just something else that came to mind when talking about the early positions. I think one of the things that we didn't do correctly in New South Wales was to get dedicated funding from Treasury, because mental health services are funded for the clinical positions, and they still are, and we are not included in that.
No.
So my position is still funded from bits of clinical roles from our acute team, our assertive outreach, and our older persons team. And this is 26 and a half years down the track.
Yeah.
So we still don't have dedicated funding for a lot of peer work positions. That
Not
they
for want of trying, though, is it?
Yeah, exactly. We have been trying. The best we have now is we've got a mental health director who, whenever there's a new rebuild, she ensures that peer work positions are built into that funding. So that's the best we can do. But there are still some positions that if the person leaves, they don't get filled, and that money just disappears. So I think there's a lot we need to do to improve the funding of peer work positions. I was on my own in the community mental health service until I think 2.5 years ago, when we got a peer stock worker. And he's peer stock, yeah. So he sits within our acute team. I rarely see him. We now also have an older person's mental health peer worker. The other thing I wanted to mention was in 1999, we had the first consumer surveyors with an accreditation organisation, the Australian Council on Healthcare Standards. And we were brought on to survey against the national mental health standards. And there were 10 of us in the first group that were trained, and I served with them for 22 years. But that was fantastic, and it was an opportunity for us to have a say in what was happening when we saw things in other services. And one example where I felt that my contribution made a difference, and it wasn't actually during the survey, and this comes to the bullying, I think, that happens with senior people sometimes. And we were visiting an inpatient service in another state, and the advocate came to me, the consumer advocate came to me, and she said, we have a unit with women where the doctor comes in and he says bag and box them to the nurses, and that meant put them in straitjackets and put them in a seclusion room. I couldn't believe it, and I knew that if I went to the nurses at the unit, they wouldn't tell me anything. So I spoke with one of my colleagues in the mental health team and asked her to go and talk to the nurses, and she was having trouble getting them to talk to her, but one nurse did, and she acknowledged that it was a regular occurrence and this was happening. And she came back in tears, saying that it was all true. The head of the team then asked to speak to the medical director, who said that under their Mental Health Act, they were able to carry out these behaviours. And so we left there feeling like we weren't actually able to make a change. But I've known Peggy Brown for some years. She was with the National Mental Health Commission, and I contacted her and I said, look, this is a real breach of, the United Nations rights of people with disabilities and mental health. I said, it's got to stop. And she was able to then put an end to it. But, we sort of, we could highlight where things were going wrong, but sometimes we couldn't make a change.
But Paula, the Act still allows for people to be put into seclusion and restraint, and it happens daily to many people across Australia, because the Acts in each state and territory allow for it. So, it's great if you manage to get it changed in one place, but we need it to change all over, don't we? What about the difficulties that you'd seen in the earlier days, and have you seen positive changes over time?
I speak of my own experience as a young man, which I found quite brutal, and it began on the journey from Wagga to Goulburn, where I was restrained in a 5 or 6 person takedown in the foyer of the Gundagai Hospital, and had my pants pulled down and injected so that I'd be sedated for the rest of the trip from Gundagai to Goulburn. And then in that ward, it was an old style ward with dormitories and things, but the acute section had beds around a ring sort of thing, and you're manic and you expect to stay in bed all day, and inevitably led to disagreements with the nurses, and often you'd be just restrained on the bed, flipped over and injected again and chuffed off to the seclusion room. I do some work now as what's called an official visitor. And so I do go around and inspect different units and look at the seclusion restraint records. And I do see a real effort from people to reduce seclusion, and some very, very enlightened nurse unit managers who are able to keep it virtually to zero in a HDU, and a high dependency unit. And so I do understand that from my work as a peer worker, and also this work and my work with the Mental Health Commission, most people who are working mental health want to do good things and are basically good people. But what happens, and has happened historically, is that the environments that we've built to treat people, so-called therapeutic care, are so inappropriate, and then they helped. Like if you have a closed room and it's damp and the mold starts to grow. So, you know, it's the same in these places, is that the culture of the places gradually becomes, well, hopefully not as bad as what Paul has said with the bag and box thing, but where the seclusion restraint is more often used. But I do think there is a concerted effort, more so in some hospitals than others, to reduce seclusion restraint. But I think until we have, you know, the exact intent of, say, the Convention of the Rights of People with Disability, and until we have human rights acts that protect people, we still allow involuntary care to happen, you know, and they're all oxymoron. They don't match involuntary care, like they just don't match. But you know, it's still going to be problematic because some people will abuse it, and it's a deeply traumatic experience. It was very traumatic for me to go through that, and it made me not want to go back to health services. At the time, I thought, I can't ever go back, or I'll find a different way of not going back, which was pretty drastic. But
That's
that's
my
yeah.
position with it too, Tim. I can't go back.
Yeah. For 5 years, I managed the Advocates Department at Macquarie Hospital, and one of the things I established was a post-seclusion discussion with a peer worker, and it was heartbreaking to hear what people were saying about their reflections on what happened and what could have helped avoid it. And, you know, some of the other things that I've seen that we have but don't use in our system is the safety plan and wellness plans. They're just not being used. So people are still not really becoming, I guess, leaders in their own care. They're not developing that self-care.
I think the mere presence of peer workers or consumer peer workers on mental health wards has a significant impact on the use of seclusion restraint. I do recall one ward in regional New South Wales where the peer worker there, whenever he was on, a seclusion would never occur, and you know, over time that culture, that sort of way of working, imbued the whole unit, and they managed to, you know, go for long periods without seclusions. But often, you know, if that person leaves, it'll kick back into.
And the story of that is in a chapter that Tim and I and the person that Tim was just talking about and his director of nursing and Mark, our CEO, were involved in writing about peer work in rural and remote mental health, which is in the handbook of rural, remote and very remote mental health. So people might like to read that chapter about peer work. Can I ask you now about what you think is valuable about peer work, Paula?
I think the role we have in education and training of students and staff, and I also do police education, and I think that's been really valuable. The health promotion work is really important. Advocacy, I think, is the most important thing that we do. But when I look at the data that I collect about my work, it's probably the least time allocation of my role is like pure advocacy. But I do a lot of peer support.
Tim, how do you think peer work works?
Well, there's a connection because of shared experience and shared experience of coercive care, of discrimination, all of those things. Often I found with young people, especially, who, you know, when you have that first contact with the system and diagnosis and medication, your world's ended. You feel as though your world's ended, and you have no hope. And I think often a meeting with a peer worker who may have been through similar things or whatever can give that person hope, and that's really powerful. I think we forget that peer work is based on ancient sort of ways of working. It's not really a new thing when we talk about the history of it. You know, I remember being on Wollongong ward and running a recovery group and you know, the guy there who was a little bit, let's use a clinical term, elevated, but he was happy. But he said, everybody come to Tim's group, you know, come to Tim's group. It's great, you know. And he said, my grandmother used to say to me, when you're sick, you don't go to the doctor, you go to someone who's got over the sickness, you know. So this is a way of working that predates medicine and doctors and things. It's the way communities support each other. It's the way wisdom is shared by people who have had experience. And you know, I think for me, you know, the most important thing to me is working with each person when you're with them and witnessing people, and you know, Paul has seen the same people come through and step up into really important work themselves and carry on the tradition. It's like handing over the baton sometimes to other people. You know, it's a community. The peer workers ourselves, we provide so much support to each other when paid supervision and things like that's very difficult for a lot of people. But you know, all of those things I think are so important. But it really is about that humanity peer workers can bring. It's the relationship, it's the sharing, it's being pretty, you know, on a accessible level, the same sort of level, and learning from the person as well that you're with.
It's kind of opposite, isn't it, to a lot of other disciplines who are taught that you don't bring your personal life into your work, and you don't take your work home into your personal life. But peer work or lived experience roles. So although my title is General Manager of Inclusion, it's a designated lived experience role, and I see it as a kind of peer worker role.
Yeah,
I think I'll always see myself as a peer worker because that's where my roots are, you know, and peer can mean so many different things to so many people. But just fairly recently, a young man in year 11 came to see me. He found my home and he came to see me, and he was in a terrible state, you know, really so much extreme anxiety. You could see his skin and eyes and hair had no luster. He was grey, you know, his skin had a grey tone to it. His eyes just looked sunken. He'd lost lots of weight. He was starting to get patches of hair falling out, you know. He said he couldn't sleep. He couldn't concentrate. So he wasn't going to school, although he was doing year 11. He wasn't able to relate to his friends or his family or anything, you know, and he was feeling suicidal, you know. So he's a year 11 boy and I'm a 63-year-old woman. But we were peers. We met where our vulnerability connects us, you know, and I spoke with him. I listened to him, just really deeply listen. And that's what peer workers do, isn't it? We go down into that deep space with the person and we sit in that space with them. We're within that, what they're going through, and while they're explaining it to us so that we can really deeply listen to what they're experiencing and how they're feeling, and what might have happened to them in the lead up to this and things. And so I listened to him a long time, and then I said to him, you know, I've experienced anxiety like that, and people don't give it enough credit. They've got no idea how extremely terribly that can impact your life, and how you can't relate, and how your body feels as well as how your mind feels and your feelings feel, and what you focus, what you notice and what you focus on and what you remember. And it's all you know, it's imploding and exploding, and it's so huge and difficult to to just sit still, sit in that space with yourself.
Yeah.
And I think that's why we often start to think about suicide, because it's just too much to sit with yourself in that pain, you know. And so I spoke with him about that. And then I said to him, but also, darling, I've been mad, certifiably mad many times, and have been scheduled and treated against my will and everything. So I know what madness feels like. And I said, I'm not a doctor, and I'm not pretending to be, but I can't see any signs of madness in you. What I see is a sensitive young man who is trying to make sense of this world that is really complex and often very cruel and not sensitive to people's needs or nature's needs, you know, or animals' needs or whatever. I see this sensitive young man, but who is strong, because you've made it this far through that terrible anxiety that you've been experiencing for 18 months. You've made it this far, so you're really strong. And I don't think you're going to go mad, but I want to tell you that if you do, in my experience, sitting in that extreme anxiety is harder than actually going mad. And although madness is terrible, that kind of anxiety that I can see in you is harder to sit with, harder to live with. And I said, so don't be afraid, because you're strong, you've made it this far. And he sat up, some color came back into his skin. Actually, he changed viscerally in front of me, you know, like it was incredible to see. His eyes shone a bit. He started breathing down into his stomach. I could see that he was only breathing in the top part of his chest before. And it was incredible. We talked for another half hour. So it was probably only an hour and a half all up. And then he went and he walked, almost skipped out the front gate. His mother found my number and called me a week later and asked me what we talked about. And I said, look, I'm sorry, darling. He came to me in confidence and we talked in confidence. And in case he needs me again, he needs to know he can trust me. I would tell you if I thought he was suicidal, but I don't think he's suicidal any longer. So I hope you can respect that for your son's sake, I'm not going to talk to you about what we talked about. And she said, oh, okay, I respect that. I understand that. I want you to know that he's eating again. He's gone back to school. He's talking about the future. He's laughing and playing games, board games with his siblings. He's relating to us at dinner. He's going out again. He's talking about the future. And a peer can feel down deep into what it is about the peer worker's lived experience that might be helpful to the person that's really suffering at the moment. We don't go to, oh, have you seen your psychiatrist? Have you, you know, like we utilize our lived experience purposefully to build connection, understanding, and hope for the future. Is that your experience of how it kind of works?
Completely. Where I work, we've got a big consumers room with TV and everything in there. And one day there was a woman in there. She was smashing up the kitchenette, and I got up because I thought I've got to go and see what's going on. When I walked in, there were 3 staff in the back row, and then there was another clinician in front of them, and they had her penned in. And there's a woman I knew. I felt very comfortable in what I did next, and I just went through them, got to her, and I just held her and said, I know you're hurting. I know you're hurting. I know you're hurting. And she just melted into my arms. And then we were able to go out and talk about what was happening for her. But, you know, she felt safe, and she knew that I genuinely cared. And I was offering her a safe space to talk. Yeah, I think we have a very special role that, you know, a clinician could not have walked up to her and hugged her like that.
No, that's right.
And
Well, they're not
and
allowed.
and I wouldn't do that to people I didn't know.
Yeah, and you
But
wouldn't
with
do it
this
to everybody, but it was what was
exactly,
needed in that moment.
in
Yeah,
that moment,
yeah.
yeah.
What
Yeah.
about you, Tim?
It's a difficult thing, and around boundaries, and you know, in some local health districts, in some places, the peer worker would have got in trouble for doing what Paula did in the olden days, and still might. You know, you can't do this, but it's such a natural thing that you've done, and that's what peer work is about. It's about, you know, being natural, and those relational things, and understanding when someone's in distress and how to react to that. And sometimes a tactile response is really important, touch is really important. But you know, for me, young people, first episode psychosis, you know, that times where people have that aha, there is a life after this. And you know, I'm bad at some things, because often with people like that, I'm still in they can ring me up, you know, years later, just to say how good they're going, or can you catch up for a coffee and things like that. We're not in a friendship, but they value checking in every now and again, letting you know how they're going, and doing all that. And they certainly value what you've done, and because we live in a world where people are misunderstood, they're lonely, their relationships are fractured, and when they do find someone who's prepared to sit down with them and listen to them, and be with them. And I think that all of those ways people can respond is evidence of what we know, is that the peer work response, the peer worker has at least as good a outcome with people in terms of their recovery as a clinical intervention. I'd like to see some more research around that, because I think it's better, and I think it's more constant, and I think it doesn't have unintended side effects. You know, it's just really powerful, and it became apparent to me very early in my work, the power of peer work and the power of having those different roles within peer work, from a peer support worker through to a peer leader, a peer elder. You know, I think that mentoring sort of stuff's really important within our workforce. Educators, researchers, lived experience has to be everywhere in our mental health systems and services, and because we make change, we change cultures, we disrupt things that are not working, and we can, you know, we can allow people to find this as a place where they feel comfortable coming to, rather than running a mile like I did as a young man, you know, not wanting to have any contact with mental health services, and thinking about suicide rather than that, you know. So, you know, I think we've got a huge role to play, and I've really enjoyed being a peer worker. Yeah.
I think it runs in our blood after a while. You know,
it does.
Yeah. So Paula, can you gave us your story about you know, the past. Could you tell us why you think peer work is important, or how it's worked for you?
Well, peer work's so important because we offer care and a gentleness and a sharing of life experience, that mutuality in our experiences of mental health issues, and we can offer practical suggestions on how things can be done differently. There will be times in committees and I'll say something thinking, oh, you know, this is just too logical, they'll think I'm silly, and it turns out that they don't think that at all, that they think, oh, okay, we hadn't thought of that. And I'm thinking, wow, you know, so you know, sometimes we provide that logical voice.
So are you saying that peer work isn't just useful for when you're delivering support to somebody, saying that it also can influence services?
Oh, very much so. And sometimes it's one worker at a time. And that can be very frustrating for peer workers who feel like they're constantly running into brick walls. But you just got to build your allies, build your allyship, and bring people on board, show them how we help other people. And yeah, it's the unconditional concern that we have for each other. Yeah.
Tim, do you feel that peer support or our lived experience can influence services and perhaps even the community as well about attitude?
Yeah, no, look, I think lived experience of mental health issues, that if we use that language, can influence the world. You know, I think we have people, I like to use the term, who touch the earth differently. And I think the perspectives and experiences of people with lived experience can, you know, reverberate throughout our communities. You know, I think we can demonstrate how people should treat each other. We can demonstrate the importance of sharing our stories and getting to know each other deeply, walking side by side and supporting each other. There's a whole lot of very valuable lessons to be learnt, I think, by lived experience. And it's important, I think, through peer work that people have a voice when that voice traditionally has been cut off and not listened to.
For sure. So we've come to the end of time that we were spending together to record this video. Is there one takeaway message that you would like to give about peer work, Paula?
That it needs to grow, that we need to have dedicated funding and the good wraparound supports for peer workforce, including efficient line management and leadership, peer work leadership, plus external peer supervision. I think that's an absolute minimum.
Tim, is there a takeaway message that you'd like people to really remember?
All of what Paul has said, but I think essentially it is about peer work being a deeply natural and human thing to do, and it is a way of supporting each other, a way of people getting over things by supporting each other that pre-exists the pathologization of mental health issues. You know, people can get better together, and I think they get better, stronger together.
And peer work's the best job in the world.
That too.
That'll have to be on my headstone, I reckon. Oh, I won't have one of these.
I've often quoted you on that, Paula.
Yes. I've heard you. Yeah.
It's amazing to feel that what has felt like brokenness in you can be really healing for people that we sit with while they're in the pain that they're experiencing, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for spending this time with me and sharing your thoughts about this. And I really value both of you. You've brought so much to the peer movement, and I value you so much. So thank you for giving us your time.
Thanks, Faye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Faye.
Bye.
Bye.